Yeah.
Hi, Heather. How are you?
Oh, hi, Miles. How are you?
I'm awesome.
I'm
Looking
so
forward to it.
excited.
We've taken a little break here with our Let's Talk, so it's nice to get back and reconnect with you. Have you
Yeah,
been? Have you had a flourishing of brilliant ideas since we've had a little lapse?
I have because I got sort of like free reign to think and talk about, I think one of my favorite topics. And one of the reasons I think that I really love to talk to you and that I trust you and keep listening to you as a teacher is is just the thoughts that you have on, first of all, spiritual bypassing, which is like a huge topic. Um, And then I know you talk a lot about this thing called McMindfulness, right? Which I feel like in a way fits with spiritual bypassing. And then this third element, which I think fits inside of definitely of spiritual bypassing, which is spiritual materialism, and kind of um, how the three feed each other, you know? So I think I don't know, I feel like we should start with just kind of defining what what these things are, right? What spiritual bypassing is, right? Do you want to
Okay.
do that? Yeah.
Maybe I can take one and you could take one. So maybe I'll do spiritual bypassing and you can introduce spiritual materialism, and we'll see where the intersection is. So spiritual bypassing is a term coined by John Wellwood in the mid '80s, roughly, where he was suggesting that we all could potentially use our spiritual practice, the technologies themselves and the methodologies, but also the principles to sidestep psychological wounding, in essence, not as a sort of pain avoidance strategy in the guise of some highfalutin philosophy or some dramatic spiritual practice. So I concur with him because we share the same space, having both been trained in East and West, and having both been therapists, and having all done our own analysis and having done our own therapy, but also working with people in a particular kind of space or discipline, namely those people that are working with meditation and yoga in some form or the other. And more recently, I would say include in that category plant medicine. The tendency is very prominent, at least in my subset of the data of the people that I work with, that there's a very high probability that at some point we're engaging in using our practices and our principles actually as a way to anesthetize or in a way to avoid dealing with more deeper wounding or unresolved issues from our past, particularly what he would call unmet developmental needs. So those are the ones that have to do with childhood yearnings that weren't unrequited love or validation that were needed as early building blocks to a stable or coherent sense of self. And so we come through the Dharma door or the spiritual door by way of suffering, which is ubiquitous. All of us, most of us, high chance that most of us come into spirituality because we're looking for solutions. And the moment we find those solutions, therein lies this sort of catch-22 where instead of using those solutions to go deeper into the wounding and make real repair, we use them to keep our wounding at arm's length. So I think that would be a sort of small summation and definition of spiritual bypassing.
Right, right. And then, I mean, and within that, there's a bunch of different little subsets, right? And I know you touched on them a little bit. There's sort of this conflict avoidance aspect of it, right? Which is like, oh, it's no big deal, whatever, which we're basically are a doormat, right? Or the codependency one, which I feel like that's my favorite one. That's one of my favorite forms of spiritual bypassing is I'm like, oh, I'm helping you, when really I'm just sort of needing that, needing that validation or that connection. And there's ones related to our teachers, and the way that we sort of act out. I know, like, parental roles with our teachers, or with spiritual guides. And the one that I'm really interested in initially, and we'll get to all the rest of the stuff, but and there's two aspects of it, but the one that I think is really interesting is this one about, using the teachings to just sort of detach, to numb out, like you were saying, to not feel. And there's definitely some crossover, I feel like, between psychotherapy, right, and Buddhist practice. And I don't know, I mean, I think first of all, I'd like to hear what you think about how these two practices, which are, which we work a lot with in this program, the contemplative studies program, in this module about trauma, how do they inform each other's blind spots, would you say? Like in terms of like, what we're not seeing in each, like what we're not seeing in the work where we're really kind of mining our feelings versus working with them in a different way on the cushion.
Yeah, maybe it's good to contextualize the current module. The contemplative studies program is a long 2-year course for people who want to engage in both Tibetan Buddhist mind sciences, but also integrated or synthesized with modern psychology, neuroscience, trauma research. And right out of the front, we have the module 2, which is really geared towards preparing people to understand the nature of trauma and the impacts of trauma on their mind, brain, relationship, and ancestry. And the reason that that's there is because because this tendency to anesthetize is so prominent. That if I think in the past I had maybe included one class on it or brought it up too late in a way. It's like it needs to be much more prominent, much more nuanced, and put right up front so that we have in our tool bag a more sophisticated understanding of what it is that we're trying to do. So we have to start with what is our motivation first and foremost. I mean, when you're trying to do spiritual practice or you're going to therapy, you want to work on processing dis-ease in some form so that you can feel free or tap some unmet access potential, to be more courageous, confident, caring, capable. So it all has that kind of beautiful upside, but the idea is that you can't get upside without first meeting the shadow. So the problem I have with more New Age philosophy and lightweight Buddhism or mindfulness or sort of the pervasive kind of secular Buddhism, and particularly the ones that sell well, is that there is this tendency to make very nice the packaging and the promise of spiritual relief without really being honest about what is required to get the treasure. If you want to use a more Campbellian mythic metaphor, one has to venture into the shadow. And so, each psychotherapy and Buddhism and mythology all have something to share in terms of helping people orient around the more shadow level work. Okay, so I really think that it's the immature side of us that wants to get the goodies without having to pay the price. I mean, you and I both have kids, and it's just part of human nature, particularly the undeveloped psyche, to want to forever live in the Garden of Eden and have your cake and eat it too, and give as little as possible and take from the world as much as possible. And that's just sort of naive, in a way, kind of child development. And many of us get arrested there in a way. And so we come to our spiritual practice with this huge blind spot that thinks that we're going to get the goodies that we've always wanted from our guru or from the spiritual practice. We're going to, drink of the nectar, but without having to pay the tax or the toll. And I think from my point of view, so let's say meditation, if you do a thorough Google search, and what you'll find is images of people who are in utter blissed out positions, and they tend to happen to be in Costa Rica on the beach somewhere in a bikini or something like that. I'm just observing that. And then I think it has a kind of predatorial aspect of marketing. I think it kind of plays into our naive childish wish or fantasy that these things would deliver us very quickly and rapidly and spontaneously to a high boon of ecstasy. Whereas and I think what psychology does is, I think behind closed doors, if you find a therapist worth their weight in salt, they often very quickly, within 6 weeks or a couple of months, the sort of naive and sort of pretext that everything is fine, the rapport is reached its critical mass so that there can be not an ascension, but actually a descension, or what they would call a regression. In other words, you come for relief, but before you have relief and you find any true relief, I mean, there can be relief in just feeling that someone's on your side and listening to you for the first time, but that's kind of short-lived or superficial relief. The real relief only comes after a period of regression. In other words, when the defenses are down and you're really truly vulnerable and you're immersed in the depths of the shadow, and there you find the trauma, you can go through vast periods of time where it's actually very uncomfortable and very scary and unsettling and unnerving. But in a way, from a mythological point of view, all that needs to happen, because through that process, what's happening is the psyche is coming undone in order for the trauma to find its way through the cracks so that it can be processed. And you can think about that in terms of like a wound that has on the skin that has like, it has pus and then it has covered over, and you have to kind of lance it open and kind of let the pus be sort of seen by the light of day, and in order for a deeper kind of transformation or healing to occur. And so I think from the point of view, just to answer very quickly and then I'll turn it back to you, but what I think therapy offers that maybe the meditative tradition is less what is less prominent is that there is a two-person engagement in the therapeutic relationship. I mean, it's not like it's absent completely in the Buddhist tradition, because you always have a preceptor or a teacher. But I don't think that people who have 500 students have the privilege or fortune to sit down regularly on a weekly basis and have individualized attention with one person checking out another person and going with them into the depths. There's like watching their blind spot. So I don't think we can conflate the two traditions and the roles of teacher and therapist. They are not the same function, and they have certain nuanced differences. And I think that one of them in the psychotherapy tradition is really with this emphasis of being a skilled friend or guide to go into that shadow material with you and survive the wish for things to be resolved and have them not be resolved. So that's one thing from and then have it be relational, because often trauma is relational in nature. If we look at people's trauma and we look at their stories, we mostly find that they involve breaches of trust or someone crossing a line and being punitive or doing something that they shouldn't have done, which has eroded our sense of trust and exposed our vulnerability and made us become defensive and closed down. And that's not really possible to heal that sitting on your cushion in a hermitage in the high Himalaya. That what is required is actually an interaction of a better type to help heal it and sort of resurface the aggravation so that the bone that has been broken can be mended. It can be regrown. The trust can be regrown. On the other hand, I think there's, in your case, you're a beautiful example of this. I mean, there is a tremendous amount of self-discipline that can be earned by way of a meditative or contemplative practice where you're basically on your own. And I have beautiful images of you in Nepal, away from the group, doing your yoga practice. You're a really dedicated practitioner. You like long retreats. You have gone into the depths of your mind as a solo person. You have been able to sit with your discomfort and the rising of your emotions. And you have a love for your practice and a strong trust in your own practice, that it has been like a shadow with you, as a kind of friend with you through thick and thin. You don't give up on your practice when it gets rainy or cloudy or distraught. You go to your practice as a kind of throughway that helps you through these tumults. And so I think there's something very powerful and courageous and as a motif in the individual technology of meditation and yoga that I think is there also as a kind of guide or assistance to help us really find a way to integrate these things on our own. And I think both are doing something unique, and collectively they are doing something more than the sum of their parts.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's definitely like working with another person, there's that relational element where you do, as you were speaking, I just was thinking, yeah, I mean, when you go through, especially with someone who has both of these elements, the psychotherapy and the practice, you actually do almost go through all of these elements with that person. That sort of like need for them to be a certain way, or you see your desire for rules, or for you want to be fixed, or whatever it is. But I think it's really interesting because, we have this relational side to practice. And when we look at the model for this practice, we see like the story of Siddhartha Gautama, which is like, there's a joke that I know our mutual friend Ethan Nichtern makes, which is like, you know, if we had to talk about that narrative, we'd say that that person had an attachment avoidance, you know, avoidant attachment style. That it sort of is like the narrative of someone who's like, I'm going to leave the world. And yet we don't all have, or many of us don't have that opportunity to leave the world behind. Do you know what I mean? So then how do we reconcile that? Like, how do we know when it is useful for us to detach from the world and do something? And when actually being in the world is, I mean, can being in the world actually be our practice? Can it be our whole practice? Or is it, like, I think of like the Bodhisattva path, and the Bodhisattva being, you know, they talk about it being the king, right? The person who is, you know, becomes sort of awake, goes off and becomes awake and then leads, or the shepherd, which is the one that goes last, or the ferry boat driver, which is the one that goes with, you know, I mean, there's lots of different ways.
It's funny. I mean, maybe I'll push back on Ethan. You know, because the Buddha's life story, the narrative or the myth or the archetypal moment of his enlightenment is preceded by a dark night of the soul moment. So I don't think that he's spiritual bypassing in that way. I think that the matter, let's put it this way, we could be arguing different points unknowingly and unnecessarily. The one point that we wanted to start with spiritual bypassing and spiritual materialism is the need to confront the shadow.
Yes.
And whether that happens in transference with a therapist, because that's what I was also detecting you talking about. Yeah. Transference is a fancy term for the way that we project unconsciously our past associated expectations and unmet needs onto another person. Projections, our angers, our needs, our yearnings, our wishes, our dreams, our expectations, our anticipations unknowingly get projected, and usually that elicits a kind of instinctual reaction from our peers, friends, colleagues, and partners, whereas in a therapeutic encounter, the therapist that is the recipient of it should be trained enough for them to detect or understand in context what those transferences are, so that they can be cast back into the awareness of the client, so that lost aspect can be integrated into consciousness. So that's a very powerful motif. But it can mean that a lot of fragmented and very disturbing emotions get kicked up and interchanged with the therapist. And in my own case, and of course there's countertransference where the therapist's own reactions are projected on their clients. So in my case, for example, I had a lot of tumult with my caregivers, my parents, and particularly I'm thinking about my mom, who was particularly very angry and explosive and unpredictable. And so I have what would be called a conflict avoidance and fearful kind of stance vis-a-vis the aggression of another. So the spiritual bypass would be if that goes dormant in my psyche, and then I find Buddhism, and Buddhism teaches a kind of high philosophy of compassion and goodwill. Then what can happen is I can easily grasp onto that. And in the service of being compassionate and kind and understanding and a decent human being, all moral values, the conflict avoidant and fearful part of my psyche remains dormant unbeknownst to me. And so that kind of wound, that pus in my psyche, never gets really fully processed. It only gets guised in the mask of nicety. And so as the therapist, then if I have a hostile client, or a client who's working out unprocessed aggressions and sees me as an authority figure and has cast me unconsciously as their own parent, there can be an unconscious collision between the forces of each psyche in a moment of tension or struggle, where, let's say, I'm afraid of the anger, which needs to come out because it's never felt safe enough to come out, whereas the client is unaware of that amount of volcanic eruption and is unaware that it really has to do with older parts of their history, maybe a parent or someone who was more abusive, and is casting that on me and putting me into that frame of reference. And so therein lies a very rich crisis and opportunity. It's a crisis because if there's not enough consciousness in either member, it can turn sour and become a real crisis. But the opportunity is that if both or one can catch and assist each other in raising that archetype to the level of consciousness, something can be tolerated and processed in actually either one, in both. So that is a very powerful metaphor motif that covers the notion of spiritual bypassing. It covers the notion of trauma, and it covers the notion of the therapeutic encounter. Now, if you switch to the image of the Buddha under the tree, in a way, I take that as him having his own self-analysis with the level of awareness that he was able to cultivate during the course of all his development and maturation and evolution. You would say he has a dramatic confrontation with his own shadow. So rather than being a two-person confrontation, it is an internal confrontation. And my point is that the confrontation is necessary and is often bypassed by the spiritual attempt to get to the goodies or the treasure without first having to do the hard work and the difficult work and the near-death experience of surviving the ordeal from the Joseph Campbell monomyth model. And so I think he is confronted with the wrath of Mara, which comes in the denizens or the lustful maidens of the archetype maidens of his lusting, and Christ did this in the desert too. There was the temptation by the devil of Christ that would give him a kingdom and all the things that he lusted for and yearned for, which he said was not going to be, which was not going to cut it. But then also the armies came, which was his deepest fears and insecurities that assailed him, and he was able to stand firm with that. And so I think that the motif is actually one of not a spiritual bypass. And I think I know where Ethan's coming from in terms of his use of that same metaphor to describe an avoidant, more of an avoidance style. And maybe that's a different metaphor, and in that context, it makes sense. Whereas in this context, I think it's important just to see that while Heather's in her yoga pose out on the lawn in Nepal of the Hyatt Hotel, it's just a start. It was impressed. It impressed me, that image, because it was like everybody was sort of having a day off, like, or whatever, like going to the market or having a snack or whatever. And I saw you like committed to your practice. So it's an archetype in my mind that has stuck there. I was really like, I really want to honor your discipline. Get rain or shine, tired or healthy or whatever. It's like you're committed to your practice. You're going to sit down. You're going to do your asana. And in a way, that's what the Buddha did. Rain or shine, he was there watching and looking and letting this stuff assail him and not reacting to it. And so I think that's the courage or empowerment of the myth or the archetype of that moment, of the confronting of the shadow.
Right. I just think it always really gets me too when I read about some of the things, that were supposedly going through his mind, that one of them that really was very painful for him was this idea of like not being able to let go of the sun in the way that he needed to, of his son, in this image of just like, he kept being like, well, maybe I'm going to, and you would see him sort of go through all of these different things, all these different shadow sides of being like, I'll just keep turning the other cheek and letting you be really, terrible to me or whatever. I'm going to keep coming back. And it was finally this ability to sort of, I guess, be with the pain of not being able to control or not being able to hold on to, that allowed the whole thing to open up, And so
yeah,
I think
like, people listening, and you and I, we can think about this. We can think we know a lot of things. We have with 10, 15, 20 years of practice. We've kind of got a nice toolkit going on, but like there are always these times, right, Heather, where we just fucking don't know, and things aren't, the practice isn't working, and nothing is there. The relief isn't being felt, and we've step through the floorboards and are suspended in a free fall, or we're in free fall, and that's really hard. Like I think those are the tests. I think those are the big tests of endurance that are required for you to stretch the kinds of muscles of fortitude and patience and self-care and self-understanding that is required for what is then found on the other side of the motif, which is the finding of buried treasure within you. It's almost like it's impossible to have these resources discovered, the gems and the jewels of the treasure of your own confidence, of your own courage, of your own fortitude, of your own ethics, your own morality, whatever it might be, the things that we want too quickly on the outset of our spiritual journey, that marketing prowess has engendered us to feel are easy to win. The truth of the matter is that you must confront a test within inside of you that you might not necessarily win. I mean, there are moments where we don't think we're going to make it.
Yeah.
And that's when the muscle is that's where the alchemical gold is being transmuted out of the fiber or out of the base metal of terror, absolute terror. In other words, courage and terror are one energy, but split, and they have to be melted down. So anybody who says that, anybody who's touting a big game but hasn't actually seen the dark night of the soul and been through a great ordeal and a more protracted long war within, I don't think they have really that they have not won that fortitude. I mean, I'm thinking about a quote that Jung said: "Beware of wisdom that is not earned. Beware of wisdom that is not earned."
Yeah.
We can take that in so many dimensions, not the least of which is talking a big game at a conceptual level has nothing to do with an actual visceral, internalized, hard-won experience that is in the depths of your being. Those are two different things. And spiritual bypassing is there's a lot of that going on where people are saying the right words, but they have not really, the true integration has not happened. And so there's not an energetic conviction about those words. There's not an integration that's aligning those words with the embodiment. And people listening can know the difference. They know the difference. It's almost like the right words that are soft landing versus the right words that are coming by way of true conviction through the body in an embodied way. And that is the difference between someone, I mean, and I'm very guilty of this. And I think that's one thing that we should be very clear of is not to judge so much, but just to take pause and to start to look at all the ways that we're being, that we're bypassing, and including most of which, me, I mean, if I'm in a position where I'm teaching people, if I'm not taking a good account of all the ways that I'm sidestepping, circumventing, touting something by way of lack of experience on a conceptual level, there's no more important thing that I can be doing than taking pause and a full assessment and inventory of all the ways I might be spiritual bypassing. And then I think that brings that level of transparency, brings greater trust in the community, because I'm not seen as a guru. I'm seen as a spiritual friend who's also working these things out. And then it disarms. It has the potential to disarm people from their own judgment and shame, which would send them into the dark forest. And so it actually helps encourage them bring out the fact that they may be bypassing. And then suddenly we've opened up the blinds or taken up the carpet and found all the muck underneath there together.
Yeah.
And there, I think then you have the chance to really clean up the context of each of our minds, but also the collective space that we're in. And isn't that true that that's what's happening in our country, culture, and globe right now? That there is both a great awakening, but there is also both a great accounting happening, where we are really confronting the shadow as a people, as a race, as a culture, as a species. There is a great accounting going on, and a lot of transparency, and a lot of gurus are falling, and we've got Weinstein to the pedophilia racket at the highest levels of politics with what's his name, Jeffrey Epstein, and his so-called suicide, which is the biggest bunch of bullshit. But he had a lot of very established people in his dirty black book, and I think we're going to see more of that. And what I'm suggesting is that, again, this is the ascension to power without dealing with the shadow is going to catch up to all of us. And spiritual bypassing is a way, that's what it is. It is an ascension to the treasure without first confronting the ordeal.
Right. I mean, and there's when you're talking, I'm thinking about a lot of these words like authenticity, and how authenticity even in one moment can be very authentic, and then in the next moment, if there's not congruence with what's actually confronting you in that moment, then it's not useful in that moment. You know what I mean? Like, I'm very interested, and this is maybe where spiritual materialism comes in, with how, when you have some of these realizations or these experiences, or we have, whether it's we're on retreat or we've just had a moment in our own practice, how we integrate that back into our lives in a way so that what we're not just doing is just kind of reliving over and over again a memory of some revelation that we had that then is not, that doesn't belong in this particular moment. Does that sort of make sense? It's almost like.
Do you have an example?
I think it's like, for example, like, let's say, I've gone on a retreat. And I've had, I've worked with all of that muck that comes up. Let's say I've gone on like a week-long silent retreat, and I've gone through all the muck, and I've had that moment of like, of understanding things in a way that almost is without words. And I go back, and for a little while, I'm able to interact with people in a different way. And I feel like there's an authenticity. And then after a while, I start to just long to go back on retreat because I just want to re-experience that moment. And I lose the ability to actually find that moment in myself, when in actuality, what I have done on that retreat is just found what's already there. Do you know what I mean? And so in this way, kind of using these practices, in a way as a tool, but then as a crutch, or the way the Buddha talked about using it as a raft, a boat to get across the water, but then you have to let go of the raft. And how hard it is. I mean, how helpful it is sometimes to think about. Like, sometimes it's really helpful for me to think about how beautiful it was to be on pilgrimage. And sometimes, what I feel is that deep pain of just like, oh God, I want to be there. And then when I dig underneath that, I'm like, things are really hard right now. You know what I mean? Like, and so I feel like we can use these things, and we can also abuse these things that help us. So I'm just kind of curious.
That's a great example. That's a great example. And so what I'm hearing is that actually the pilgrimage served its purpose the first time, but then the second time it could be actually taking you away from sitting in the muck and processing the muck, and causing an over-reliance on the crutch rather than actually dealing with what it has stirred inside of you. Yeah. And so in a way, your spiritual practice, the pilgrimage, the over-reliance on the teacher, the over-reliance on the intellect, or the over-reliance on the concept, the great highfalutin philosophy, they can all be used in the service of disconnecting you with the actual ordeal in your belly, where it feels unpleasant, it feels scary, it feels terrifying, it feels lonely, it feels shameful. And yet that is the very thing that all of those things that I mentioned on the list, the guru, the teachings, the principle, they're all designed to actually help you make a relationship, a direct relationship with the source of the discomfort, in order for there to be a deeper penetration and a newer understanding or newer relationship formed there. And so I think that's a perfect example of the potential opportunity and crisis latent in a spiritual bypass. In other words, that's why we shouldn't judge spiritual bypass, because if you catch yourself doing it, it can lead you down a kind of Jacob's ladder downwards into the very source material that you really need to discover what it is that you're trying to ascend from too quickly.
One of the other things that I'm also, and this is maybe one of the last things that I'm really interested in, and I think you are as well, is, a lot of people, their first spiritual experience comes via like mushrooms or, dropping acid or something like that. And there's a lot of people that are working with that right now in a lot of different ways. And I'm just wondering, I mean, for some people, they don't have the context then of a way to work with it. It's like an isolated encounter. And then, it's like, how do you hold that dissonance in your life without some sort of map, and then how, and this is actually a question when I think about it that I've had for many, many years, ever since I first started, like back in 2001 or 2002, I remember being embarrassed to ask the teacher, like, what about people that like, I think my first spiritual experience was when I had an acid trip, and I found this stuff, but like some people don't, or I don't know, like, what do you think about that?
I'm slowly refining my kind of appraisal of the situation. I think on the one hand, our culture and society is at a state where plant medicines, ayahuasca, drug research, psychedelic experiences are in a huge renaissance. So they're a huge explosion of interest. And I think as opposed to where they were in the 60s, they are now much more mainstream and has been endorsed by the academic institutions. We now see a half dozen very prominent research hospitals adopting, securing funding and adopting a medical research of psilocybin and mushrooms at NYU, Johns Hopkins, and others, Yale, I think. And so what this to me shows is that there's a irreversible trend. It has now gone mainstream, and it is the way of the future. Okay. And I some 15 years ago coined the term McMindfulness because at that point we were seeing the same trend in the meditative world. Right. It was undoubtedly picking up steam, and it was appearing to catch a wave, and it was seemingly everywhere in every book and on every front page of every magazine, and it was just an explosion. And I think you were there at a time picking up your yoga practice in the first wave of yoga, which was the same kind of phenomenon. There was always yoga around, but in pockets here and there. And I don't know if you were living in New York at that time, but possibly, in the early 80s, would it have been? Early 90s, maybe. There may have been 3-4 prominent teachers, but it was a very small kind of underground sort of scene. And then boom, it just fucking exploded. And then, now we can look back and go, in 3 waves and 3 successions, we see the same phenomenon happen where something in the fringe of the collective psyche became more prominent and caught a popular wave. And what that did was push the movement forward. But if we're very honest, that first initial wave also had its own shadow. Right. And so at the time that I was making my critique on McMindfulness, I was seeing the shadow side of this big plethora. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't also acknowledge the power and the potential value that mindfulness, secularized mindfulness, taken out of context and deliver on the mass market had. It would be an idiotic of me to deny that. On the other hand, what I didn't sense that people were appreciating or taking a hard look at was what are the potential downsides of it. And I think that happened with yoga. I think that happened with mindfulness. I think Ron Purser took mindfulness to a whole new level with his using that as his cornerstone of his new book, which I recommend people read because it definitely caught the zeitgeist at the exact moment it needed to. It's like even I may have just created a little ruffle with it, but then boom, Ron Purser's use of it, hitting it at the apex, if you will, really caught many more people's attention. And so that warning, in a way, has now been adopted. And I think many more people were ready after kind of a big bubble starting to see that there's a shadow here. And I'm going to say it now on record, there is an equal shadow emerging with the plant medicine world. I'm not denying its inherent potential value. If it's done right in context, with a delicacy and attention to set and setting and purification and as a rites of initiation with a shaman, possibly many more aspects need to be included in that recipe. Certainly the tail end of any initiation needs a long period of integration, which I know is not happening. So what I'm going to say is that the Plantasia movement, which is my version of McMindfulness, everybody's fascination with plants has a kind of juvenile Mickey Mouse kind of aspect to it, where people think it's the Holy Grail. Just go and drop quickly make your way down to Peru or to Mexico or to Costa Rica for a 3-day retreat in a health spa where you're paying $350 a night and getting a really good attention and dropping your plant, and then come back. And then when those people come back, having had an experience like that, the press get wind of the deep openings of the universe that have been revealed. But what is very seldom talked about is what happens when they come knocking on someone like my door and saying, I've had this revelation and I actually feel really disturbed by what I saw, and I don't know how to integrate it, and I have no one to talk about it, and I've left the ceremonial circle now and I'm on my own and I can't really make heads or tail of it. And it becomes a fanciful kind of thing that kind of fades. And so it's, in a way, it's misplaced. Or the worst thing that I've seen recently is some 25-year-old, and I have nothing against 25-year-olds. I do as one, and a very bright-eyed and bushy-tailed myself. But I can see someone get hold of such a powerful medicine, and suddenly, within one ceremony, they see themselves as a great shaman and are, wanting to conduct their own shamanic ceremonies and touting and sort of creating a mass sort of not zeitgeist, but a mass impulse towards doing these things. And again, not aware of the shadow. And so what I'm suggesting is that there is inherent value in a lot of these things. But if we're not careful, these things, and I think plant medicine is not like meditation. I think it's a powerful substance. And so, I think there's a shadow to using meditation. People could have monkey around and not address fundamental traumas and get really high on their samadhi and actually not deal with the things that they need to deal with. That's totally possible. And the Buddha, all the way back at the Buddha's time, he would have said the same thing. But when you're dealing with plant medicines, it's such a powerful mind-altering substance. I'm scared to say that there's potential damage that might be caused in the psyche. And again, I'll return to this quote by Jung: beware of the wisdom that is unearned. So if you have too dramatic and too spontaneous and too sudden a breakthrough, and yet don't have the container in which to really integrate and process and metabolize and internalize, who knows what might be going on. And we're so young in this movement that I don't think that's quite been talked about enough. So I think it's nice that you brought it up, because it gives us both a chance, the time to reflect on it. Certainly it's not part of my path. I mean, having taken the Bodhisattva vows and the Tantric vows, the use of medicine is not part of my practice. But I'm also not suggesting that I judge that practice. What I'm really judging is the naivety to which we gravitate to these spontaneous sort of practices, and the immense amount of idealized fantasy we put place on them, and the kind of wish that we have that they would serve as panacea without the receptivity and fortitude to do the harder work. I think that's common in all three waves: yoga, meditation, and plant medicine.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I'm really coming away from this whole discussion with is this image of the shadow, and how much, like, the shadow is part of the light, right? I mean, it's if a light shines on you, there is a shadow, right? And your shadow is always going to be with you. Sometimes it's in front of you and you can see it. Sometimes it's next to you. Sometimes it's behind you. Sometimes you can't quite see it, right? But it's almost like, I feel like sometimes we think we're going to get rid of the shadow, but the shadow is always going to be there, and that we have to integrate the shadow. I mean, like, I'm even thinking about this time of year, this sort of like Halloween time, and why are people so drawn to Halloween? Aside from the fact that it's fun, that you get to dress up, but you get to kind of be the shadow if you want to, or you're really deeply honoring this thing that otherwise you're just like, no. But it's like this really sort of culturally accepted way to be like, let's move into the darkness, and it's really interesting. I mean, I think that, yeah, I mean, a lot of that just comes from the work that we've been doing with Jung in the program. I think is just like the shadow has to be there.
Yeah, that's amazing that we're kind of we're vacillating between module 2 on trauma and module 3 on the hero's journey and the work of Jung, and that's fine. I think I learned so much from preparing and going through it. But I think you're right. I think like what Jung was suggesting was that as opposed to Freud, Jung was suggesting that there's always going to be an unconscious. Yeah. Whereas Freud thought he would be able to use the light of awareness to dispel the darkness of the unconscious. Jung is suggesting that the psyche is, the unconscious is so vast that it's always going to be there. And in fact, it actually serves a purpose, and actually it's a compensatory function. In other words, consciousness, light and dark, are dualities that serve to balance or counterweight each other. And so the shadow is not an enemy. The shadow is an aspect of the totality of the psyche that is designed to elicit imagery and emotions that would help us integrate and become a larger sense, increase our sense of self. In other words, the shadow is there to help us digest and process things in an opportunistic time. And so I think it's great that you use this metaphor of the of Halloween, because I think, yes, culturally, it's like we give ourselves one day to give permission to the bestial side of ourselves, the id impulses, the dramatic fear, aggression, sexual, whatever it might be. But what does it suggest about all the 350 other days of the year? It's like all that stuff is always there. So don't think that you're be careful who you think you are. I mean, you're not just your persona, good little schoolboy, good little schoolgirl, always in line and always morally correct and always morally pure. You are also a heathen, and you are also a killer, and you're a mass murderer. And if we're really going to enjoy the prospects of this notion of interconnectivity, then we also have to understand that interconnected and intertwined within all the positive aspects of potentials that we can embrace, we also have to accept all the terrible, terrific aspects of our psyche too, including all of our ties to racism, all our ties to pedophilia, all our ties to vice, all our ties to history, unfathomable history, in greater increasing circles throughout history that ties us to all the things that people have done to each other. That is also within us, and to suggest that we're just bubbling on top of the surface, far removed from all that, is absolutely asinine. In fact, that is dangerous. And so what we're talking about is really mature spirituality. I mean, that's a hard sell. You cannot mass market that stuff, that you're a killer. That in the right kind of context, in the right kind of conditions. And this is what we learned from Lord of the Flies, right? I mean, there is a little piggy inside all of us that we could potentially kill. We could kill them off. We have prejudices, we have biases, we have unmet yearnings that could turn to powerful aggressions. I mean, these are archetypes within all of us. And if we just pretend to roll our yoga mats out and feel good, or do a few pranayama breaths and do some chanting, or act piously and do a campaign for others, which are all good things, but to the expense or to the detriment or without including this other side, I think it's very superficial and potentially dangerous.
Yes. Oh my goodness. Oh dear. The whole time I have this track from this song from the 90s by a band. I think it was like Nitzareb or something, called Every Day is Halloween, where it's this person is like, why can't I live a life of ease? Why must I take the abuse that's served? Why can't they see that just like me, it's the same with the whole wide world, And it's like, it's like, why were that? I mean, yeah, it's like, we hear those little nuggets and we know they're true. And then whatever we choose to do with them, with that dissonance that's here, that's, I feel like, what the meditation practice does for us, is it takes that dissonance that's right here and says, just stay with it for a minute and allow that part of you to be true too. That's exactly what you're saying,
Yeah, and I just want to bring this up because I'm also having an urge to talk about this, that our politically correct culture tries to make everything nice, and to equalize everybody, and to give everybody equal opportunity, and to sanitize and create safe spaces, which you can see comes from a very noble, virtuous agenda, right? I mean, of course we want to empower people. Of course we want equality. Of course we want people to feel safe, right? I mean, those are virtues. But without looking at the shadow, and without going into the depths of what might be lurking underneath people who are touting those kinds of politically correct nuances, I think you can see that after several months and many, many months of the evolution of this process, you can start to see the chaotic and dysfunctional nature of some of these agendas, in which the blind spot has now emerged, where even people who have a virtuous, noble intention, without looking deeply into their own psyche, can find that victim can themselves become abuser. And so you have witch hunts, and you have vehement opposition, and you have people actually who want inclusivity actually touting exclusivity. And you have people who want safe spaces to actually now they're policing and actually becoming bullies to sanitize the conversation. And I think that is very dangerous, because I think what is required with real shadow work is friction. You know,
Yeah.
so some level of responsible rules need to be applied to form an appropriate container. But then within that appropriate container, people need to have space to bump up ideas, conversing respectfully, but also being also allowing themselves to have their convictions be espoused. And even if it's a direct threat or confrontation to another person, because that friction then can eventually culminate in some synthesis where some light of new awareness can be sought. And yet, if you try to sanitize that in conversation and police people into telling them what they can and cannot say, I think all those urges go underground, and they're not well articulated. And if they're not well articulated, they're not well formulated. And if they're not well formulated, then they can have this shadow aspect that can come out as an aggressor. It can come out as an abuser. And the noble intention that was henceforth set originally can be usurped. And one can become dramatically hypocritical and not further their agenda, but actually undermine their agenda. So I think this is what I'm noticing on the global landscape. And all you have to do is spend 15 minutes on Facebook to see that there's a lot of people touting some high hubris virtue, and yet the way that they do it shows the lack of sensitivity to their own shadow process. And yet, in so doing, they become that which they seek to eliminate. And that's not helping anyone.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really grateful that I have, like, you know, there's a group that I help to facilitate, and I feel like just creating a safe space where all of that can come up and come out, and not you know, and one of the rules of the space is that we can't, like, you know, necessarily offer feedback for someone's statement or answer their question or philosophize on it. So it's like everyone is able to just be like, oh, this is what feels really hard and icky for me, and we all have to sit there for a minute and be like, you know what I mean? And then the next person, and it's really, it creates this space that feels like there's like I mean, we call it vulnerability, working with vulnerability bravery, you know, because you can truly be like, you know, and to say, like, what you just, you know, I don't know. I mean, you can't be like, what you just said offended me, but you can be like, right now I feel this way, you know, and there's a statement, right now I feel this. And it's really, it's really helpful, you know, because I think everyone's really just trying to examine. I think there's a lot of shame that comes up for a lot of people, and that gets really hard, you know, that the shame then, makes people sort of go quiet, you know, or stops people from actually working. You know, it's hard. It's really, it's such a difficult time. Yeah. I mean, I think that's why I feel like, you know, it's like, how do we make this work, this spiritual work, like, you know, alive in the world? You know what I mean? How do we make working with the shadow in real time, in relationship? This can be another path. I mean, some people call it liberation, right? You know, how can we become liberated all together, you know? And it really is like, we have to be like, oh, look, I brought my shadow. Did you bring your shadow? Oh, look, our shadows are touching each other, you know? Oh, look, our shadow's making one big shadow, you know? I think it's really, yeah. I think it's almost scary to talk about it. I mean, I feel a little like,
it's very scary. I mean, now's the time for courage. I mean, if you deflate the conversation, it's not that courageous. I mean, this is what we're saying at the beginning, at the outset. We're saying that before you get the treasure, you need the ordeal. Yeah. What we're saying is the ordeal is essential. Okay. And so part of the spiritual work means that you have to sit in your shame.
Yeah.
But part of the liberal PC culture agenda is to take away all the factors that might contribute to that sense of shame. And so you're deprived of your opportunity to sit with it. And what I'm suggesting is take it one step further. If your shame dictates the terms, and then I have to be silent and I get cast out, what do you stand to gain? We take all the wind out of the sail, or the wind out of the balloon, for you to process that shame. And if I make an assertion that brings your feeling, and then your feeling in the PC culture is the thing that determines the entire process, like if it's offensive for you, we have to stop. But what we stand to lose is, why is it offensive? And can you come back at me out of that sense of offense and come forward and find your voice, so that we can go back and forth and back and forth. And yes, it's a little volatile. And yes, it's like two sticks being rubbed. And what can happen when two sticks being rubbed to generate friction? And what can happen at the end of friction is the culmination. Some fire is produced, some creative aspect is produced. And I think that that's the risk that we have to take. Now, I'm not saying that ad hominem attacks should be part of this. And that's what you find on Facebook is like, the minute that people feel offended, they throw stones at each other's personality. What I'm suggesting is a group of mature enough people to tolerate the ambiguity of their own feelings and survive the potential upheaval of their own feelings in the service of going back and forth so something further can be articulated, in the hopes that once it's articulated, some new understanding. And what we're doing there is we're actually involving an integration between two aspects. The aspect of you and your uncomfortable feeling and me and my uncomfortable feeling are surviving a cataclysm, but also the aspects of your right and left brain are also becoming integrated, because you are making better sense of a right brain affect deep inside your own psyche. Your emotions are now being put in context so your brain can create a new narrative. So this is what's possible. We call that integration.
Right. And that's when your idea of something like Sangha expands, right? When you have this community of people that you believe share, say, something like goodness, right? And so you can actually safely explore these things because you're all not everyone has their own personal agenda so much. And it's just like, how can we help each other? How can we be like,
or people's agenda come out? I mean, that's the other thing is like, I think there's some basic agreement that this is going to, we are all agreeing to get uncomfortable, and we're all agreeing that we're not going to agree. In other words, you're going to have your thoughts on something and I'm going to have my thoughts on something. And this is not about winning the debate. This is about creating conversations and surviving each other's conflicting ideas and surviving our own emotions about them, so that there can be a potential synthesis on the tail end.
Right.
Rather than saying it's all sanitized, so your thoughts and your feelings go subterranean, where we actually empower them from beneath the surface. And so aggressions and hostilities and prejudice aren't allowed to come out to the party, to the light of day, to be integrated. They actually steer the ship from the underground, from the subterranean regions. And so that actually, to me, is more dangerous a prospect. And so to come full circle on the conversation, I mean, I think this is what the benefit of yoking psychotherapeutic work, trauma work, the shadow, spiritual work, community work. I mean, if you're starting to put all these threads together, which we are doing in the modern age, we have exposure to a vast array of threads that we can now pull on and draw on to make a bigger unified perspective of the totality. I think we are affording ourselves a greater opportunity to really come together on some of these things, but it's not easily won, is my point.
Sure. Oh. We have gone for a very long time.
Well, thank you for pushing it. I mean, you brought up all these great things and I just went for it. So thank you so much, Heather, once again. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, I know. I'm grateful. I love talking to you. So we'll keep going. If people have other things they want to hear about, right? Bring them up, right? Bring them out.
Okay. We'll see you next time. Thanks, Heather. Take good care. Thanks everybody for listening. Bye.